I was the one who signed the transfer order, so I suppose I am the one who has to tell it straight, even the parts that make me look like a fool. My name is Ordos Fane. For 31 years I have kept the hollow stacks, the deep record hall beneath the ivory keep, and in all that time I never once needed help from anyone who did not already understand a filing rod from a binding pin. So when the transfer notice came up from the surface offices, one human clerk, reassigned from the outer archive after a fire took her old posting, I did not welcome her. I did not reject her either. I simply had no time for her. I gave her a corner of the ruined East Gallery, where the indexing wheel had seized 11 years before during a tremor and never turned again, and I told her to make herself useful sorting loose leaves until someone with real training could be spared. I did not expect that to be true for very long. I did not expect it to be true for the rest of my working life. Her name was Wren Calloway. She was younger than I'd guessed from the file. Dark-haired, quiet in the way of someone who has learned that quiet gets more done than talking. She did not ask about the wheel. She did not ask why 3 chief chronologists before her had taken one look at its rusted teeth and its scattered unlabeled record drums and declared the East Gallery a lost cause, sealed and forgotten behind a curtain of dust cloth. She only asked where the ladders were kept and whether anyone minded if she ate her midday meal at her desk instead of the hall. For the first month I forgot she existed. I had my own catalogs, my own century of correspondence to keep straight, and the East Gallery was, as far as the rest of the keep was concerned, a tomb. What I did not know, what I only learned much later, piecing it together the way I am piecing it together now, was that she was not alone down there. There was another clerk working the same gallery, a slight, soft-spoken young attendant who gave the name Syl and the rank of nothing much at all, and who Wren simply treated as a coworker. She shared her bread with Syl at midday. She taught Syl how to restring a binding pin without splitting the leather. She complained, the way one complains to someone who will actually listen, about the impossible wheel and the impossible dust and the impossible cold of the deep stacks in winter. She never once asked Syl where they came from, or why their hands, for all their willingness, plainly did not know a day's honest labor. She simply handed over half her lunch and got on with the sorting. It took her the better part of 4 months to understand the wheel, not through any device I would have approved, if she'd asked me, which she did not. She rebuilt the entire index by hand, every drum pulled, dusted, read, and recatalogued onto a ledger of her own ruling, cross-referenced by a system she'd invented herself because ours had rotted with the gears. Drum by drum, shelf by shelf, in a cold room nobody else would enter. I found out much later that she kept a second, smaller ledger just for the drums that made no sense at all. Records logged under dates that hadn't happened yet, or names that matched no family in any of our books. And instead of reporting them as damaged, the way 3 chronologists before her had, she simply set them carefully aside in their own labeled case, on the theory that a thing you cannot yet explain is not the same as a thing that is broken. I have come to think that was the truest instinct she had. Syl, apparently, found this endlessly interesting. Wren told me once, offhand, months after the fact, that her quiet coworker used to sit on an overturned crate reading the mismatched drums aloud while Wren worked the shelves, laughing at some of the dates, going very still at others, and never once explaining why. Wren never pressed. That was, I have since decided, the whole of her method. She did not need to know a person's history to be decent to them in the present. She fixed tea for 2 on the little grate in the corner. She taught Syl to splice a torn page spine with waxed thread instead of glue, because glue yellows and thread doesn't, and Syl practiced it for a week on scraps until the seams were nearly invisible. It is a small thing to teach someone. It does not read, on the page, like very much. I only know that by the 3rd month, the 2 of them had a rhythm to their working days that neither of them had had before, in that gallery or anywhere else. When she finally freed the seized wheel itself, it wasn't with any tool the keep's engineers would have recognized. There was no torch, no chemical bath, none of the equipment my requisition forms would have approved if she'd bothered to file one, which she did not. She worked a season's worth of grit out of the teeth with a boar bristle brush, and her own patience, tooth by tooth, the way you'd groom a matted animal that had long since given up being groomed, and had to be coaxed back into trusting a hand near its face. She oiled the shaft with rendered tallow because the proper oil had been off the supply manifest for a decade, and she packed the worn bearing sleeve with braided cord until it sat snug again. Then, on a 6th-day afternoon with no ceremony at all, she leaned her whole weight into the crank and the wheel turned. Not fast, not grand. It turned the way it was always meant to, groaning once, and then quiet, and then turning as easily as if it had never stopped. I only came to see any of this because the keep's household guard came down into my stacks in force, 20 of them, searching every gallery for the Crown Ward, who had gone missing from the Surface Palace some 5 months prior and was, by then, presumed by half the court to be dead. I did not think to look twice at the quiet clerk dusting drums beside my new transfer. Neither, apparently, had anyone else in 5 months. It was the guard captain who recognized the birthmark at Sill's collar, and went white, and dropped to one knee on my archive floor. The ward, I will use her true name now, Iseult, since there is no more hiding it, did not deny who she was. She only asked, quite steadily, whether Wren could come up with her, since Wren was the only person in 5 months who had spoken to her like she had a name worth using instead of a title worth managing. The captain did not know what to do with that request. Neither, frankly, did I. There was a great deal of noise after that. The regent wanted to reward the human archivist handsomely. A title, an estate on the coast, a permanent seat at court. Wren stood in my ruined gallery in her dust-gray work smock, ledger still under one arm, and said she didn't want any of it. She said she'd come to the keep to keep records, and the wheel worked now, and she'd like to keep doing that, if it was all the same to everyone. Iseult did not argue with her, which told me more about the girl than any of the guard's questions had. She only asked that Wren be given a standing hour, twice a week, to read with her in the gallery. Not court business, not lessons, just the two of them and whatever drum happened to be open on the table. It was granted, of course. What wasn't going to be granted, once the ward herself had asked for it in front of half the household. I still run the hollow stacks. Wren still keeps the East Gallery, though it isn't ruined anymore. The wheel turns clean. The drums are catalogued in a system half the Surface archivists have since copied without crediting her for it, which she has never once complained about. Twice a week the Crown Ward comes down the old stair herself, past the guards who no longer follow her, and sits at the same battered table where she once passed as nobody in particular, and reads with the woman who never once needed to know who she was to treat her like she mattered. I was wrong about a great many things over those months. I was wrong that the wheel was beyond saving. I was wrong that a transfer clerk with no pedigree had nothing to teach a 31-year archivist about his own stacks. But I was most wrong, I think, in assuming that the important work down in my hall was the cataloging. It was never the drums. It was a woman sharing her lunch with someone she thought was just another tired clerk, and asking for nothing back, and getting, in the end, more than any of us could have arranged for her on purpose. The wheel still turns. That part, at least, I understood from the start.